Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy 2. The topic for our discussion today is global markets and national politics. We know that the world that has been ushered in by globalization is basically a celebration of worldwide capitalism. But this capitalism and globalization that we are witnessing is not a reality that is unfolding over a level playing field. And the rules of the game that have been heralded in by globalization, particularly in the realms of international trade and finance, they have impacted upon states differently across the world. Mehdi, disclosing the contents of the globalization package, argues that nations are driven by globalization towards liberalizing trade and capital markets, internationalizing of production and distribution strategies, and increasing technological change. What are the imperatives of this globalization? We see today that across the world, states have taken a backseat. Not that they've been eclipsed, I will touch upon this later also. But definitely there has been a transformation in the role of the state, and what we see in operation are various regimes unfolding across the world in the realms of human rights, in the realms of environment, in the realms of global governance, economic management, and likewise. Globalization encourages nations to rapidly dismantle barriers to international trade of goods and services and promote the mobility of capital. Unlike development, on which everybody knows what is being talked about and could make prediction on the future, the mention of the word globalization rakes up, on the side of the developing countries, the devastating effects of structural adjustment programs on their economies. The conditionality of Western aid is something we all know. But I would still like to reiterate that the story of globalization has a long history. We can go back to the times of traditional imperialism, when the British industrialized countries were trying to set sail across the seas worldwide and capturing different parts in Africa, Asia, and Latin America and converting them into colonies. In the post-World War period, we find that these colonies were no longer possible to be maintained, and that is why these European countries gave independence to their colonies and retreated back into their shells. But the desire for global control rankled large with the European countries and the European imperialist powers. And that is exactly what has also unfolded through the phenomenon that we today call globalization, which is nothing but an extension of worldwide capitalism. In fact, very interestingly, Deepak Nair and Amit Bhaduri in their book, An Intelligent Person's Guide to Liberalization, comment that liberalization, privatization, and globalization are all euphemistic expressions celebrating the high noon of capitalism. So what are the constituents of this economic apparatus of globalization? Globalization has witnessed the enhanced and the ascendant role of global economic institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. These three international economic institutions constitute the formal institutional architecture of globalization, and they are like the bandmasters who set the tune of the economic policy across the world. And countries in different parts of the world have no choice but to play second fiddle to the tune that is set by these bandmasters. They thereby enjoy the privileged position of making and enforcing the rules of a global economy that is sustained by significant power differentials between the northern and the southern hemispheres. Globalization, however, is not an unalloyed blessing. While it has unleashed opportunities for economic growth and progress across the world, it is true that because it does not unfold over a level playing field, various sections of populations in different countries of the world cannot really take advantage of the opportunities ushered in an age of globalization. Joseph Stiglitz, in his book Globalization and its Discontents, tries to draw attention to this dark side of globalization. He comments that the ideas and intentions behind the creation of the international economic institutions were good ones, yet they gradually evolved over the years to becoming something quite different. The Keynesian orientation of the IMF, which emphasized market failures and the role of the government in job creation, was replaced by the free market mantra of the 1980s, which is commonly referred to as the Washington Consensus, a consensus between the IMF, the World Bank, and the US Treasury about the right policies for developing countries that signaled a radically different approach to economic development and stabilization. In the 1980s, the bank went beyond just lending for projects like roads and dams and infrastructure to providing broad-based support in the form of structural adjustment loans. But it did this only when the IMF gave its approval. And with the approval came important conditions that were pinned down on the country. It is common knowledge now that Western aid is seldom aid without strings. It is not only that the country has to qualify to obtain it. It's not that a country senses the need for monetary support and it gets aid or help from these Western loan-giving institutions. It has to qualify for aid, and once it has received aid, it has also to perform and fulfill certain conditions. It is only on the fulfillment of those conditions that aid depends, because let us not forget that the aid that is dished out is for all practical purpose a loan which has to be repaid with interest. The IMF was supposed to focus on crises, but developing countries were always in need of help, so the IMF became a permanent feature of their life and their existence in the developing world. And the governments of independent states are supposed to act as superconductors of capitalism. We know that multinational corporations are among the major instruments of neocolonial domination, which many people say is just another synonym for the kind of globalization that we are witnessing today. Multinational corporations basically operate extensively throughout the third world because they have converted the third world into happy hunting grounds, and their profits are ensured through and through and allow them to reap super abnormal profits. Multinational corporations, therefore, encroach upon the policy-making space of the third world, which is why Vernon has come up with his interesting book called Sovereignty at Bay. Now, these multinational corporations encroach upon the policy-making space of the third world. What they do is they siphon off huge portions of money to domestic business groups who often fund major political parties before elections in particular. And when those parties come to power after elections, they naturally have to come up with policy changes and interventions which are in harmony with the interests of the Western imperialist powers and the multinational corporations. And not only do they intrude in domestic policy, even in regard to foreign policy, we find that multinational corporations and Western powers interfere with the third world so that the third world is perennially in a state of political instability, which of course perpetuates their dependence on the West. In an age of globalization, politics has been rendered almost powerless, therefore, by an unstoppable techno-economic juggernaut that will crush all governmental attempts to reintroduce restrictive policies and regulations, which is why liberalization has become such a worldwide trend. Endowing economics with an inner logic apart from and superior to politics, they look forward to a new phase in world history in which the main role of the government will be to act as a superconductor and perhaps facilitator of global capitalism. So is, as I was referring a moment ago, sovereignty of the nation state really at bay in an age of globalization? Let us see how sovereignty is impacted by globalization. The message that seems to get conveyed from all that we have seen so far is that globalization inevitably involves the decline of bounded territory as a meaningful concept for understanding political and social change. Consequently, they harp on the notion that political power is located in global social formations and expressed through global networks rather than through territorially based nation states. As territorial divisions are becoming increasingly irrelevant in an increasingly globalizing world, which is why the phenomenon of globalization is often linked to that of a borderless world, states are becoming less and less capable of determining the direction of social life within their borders. Thus, nation states seem to have lost the kind of dominant role they exercised earlier in today's global economy. It seems that one can hardly refute that recent economic developments like trade liberalization and deregulation have significantly constrained the political options open to states, particularly in the global south. Global markets indeed frequently undermine the capacity of governments to set forth their national policy objectives independently and impose their own domestic standards. One is therefore impelled to acknowledge the decline of the nation state as a sovereign entity and the ensuing devolution of state power to regional and local governments as well as to various supranational institutions. I have just explained to you how in an age of globalization, multinational corporations and Western imperialist powers encroach upon the policy-making space of the third world, particularly in the realms of domestic policy where funds are channelized through indigenous business groups to political parties who, when they come to power, will obviously come up with policies that are desired by the Western powers. But that kind of encroachment also is visible with regard to foreign policy of states. In all, we can definitely say that the sovereignty of the third world is definitely at bay. But this need not give us the impression that the state has been thoroughly eclipsed in an age of globalization. You see, what has happened is that the states have undergone some kind of a metamorphosis, and we will shortly see some kind of a nuanced role on part of the states. Governments still have a substantial role to play in making their economies more or less attractive to global investors. Despite the fact that globalization entails a shrinking on the state's role in terms of certain traditional domains of functioning, the state is not really approaching any kind of an eclipse, because even in the context of the Western world, there are certain domains over which the state's role is not likely to diminish in the foreseeable future. In particular, the state is a vital necessity in the third world, where Jagdish Bhagwati in his book In Defense of Globalization says that the whole process of globalization has to be tailored by the state concerned in light of its fundamental characteristics, and many of them are often unique. And not only will the state be required to tailor globalization to its situational reality, it will also have to come up with remedial measures so that those actions which are inconvenienced by the competition that has been ushered in an age of globalization are able to take advantage of the opportunities rather than sink under the weight of liberalization. When we shift our focus to the third world, the effects of globalization seem to suggest the need for the state all the more, particularly in view of the differential impacts of globalization across the regions and states of the world. And not only is there inequality across the world, even within states we find various categories ranging from the rich to the poor. Scholars remind us that while globalization suggests the idea of a worldwide interconnectedness and in some sense an irreversible process, it is a phenomenon which has to be found to be exercising differential impacts across countries and regions of the world and even within particular countries. We should try to make a distinction between the irreversible technological advancements which have produced an interconnected world and the economic structures and policies which have purposely been put in place by the US starting from the end of the Second World War and are still being introduced by the former to enable Washington and also other Western countries to have faster and unrestrained access to markets worldwide. I told you that in the past, when imperialism assumed its earlier forms like colonialism, states throughout the world in Africa, Asia, and Latin America were totally under the dominant and the thumb of the Western imperialist powers. That changed color like a chameleon in the post-World War scenario when we see the emergence of the phenomena called neocolonialism. The states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, freshly emancipated from independence, were of course independent nation states, but they continued to be manipulated in such subtle and surreptitious ways by the Western imperialist powers that It seemed as if colonialism had revisited the world in a new guise, and that is what we call neocolonialism. The current globalization that we are witnessing is not far removed from that same story of the domination of the West over the rest of the world, and that is exactly what has prevailed in the Washington Consensus. We find that one dramatic way in which contemporary globalization differs from earlier globalization is that earlier globalization was spawned by technological innovations and changes. Today, in addition to the technological change manifest in all kinds of gadgets, we find that the globalization is also happening through polity interventions, whereby states of independent countries all over the world, even in the third world, are trying to tailor liberalization policies in their own regimes so that the basic work related to economic production and exchange are relegated more and more to private players. Viewed from the latter angle, globalization is a deliberate effort to effect changes in the world economic structure to suit the designs of the liberal democratic model of the developed world, which aims at capturing markets in the third world countries. Thus, globalization, according to this interpretation, is definitely neocolonialism in its most sophisticated form. This can be illustrated with reference to the story of Bangladesh. The present globalization process is essentially monopoly capitalism advancing on a world scale that seeks to integrate the peripheral economies into a single global system. As a peripheral economy, Bangladesh has got more marketized, more globalized, more urbanized, and more liberalized, and in the process, it now has a large number of super rich and an increasing number of uprooted poor people. That is one of the difficulties we witness in an age of globalization, where there is a stark gap between the ultra rich and the pathetic poor. The fate of Bangladesh is now being determined not by elected bodies, not from any initiative from within, but by bureaucratic global institutions which have authority but do not bear any responsibility for their actions. This is one of the faces of peripheral capitalism in late global capitalism. Globalization, of course, has ushered in growth. It would be impossible to deny the advantage that globalization has extended to countries across the world. The problem, however, is that the growth that globalization entails is not necessarily inclusive. One can hardly deny that liberalization has resulted in growth and development in case of a number of countries as a result of integration with the world economy. One may particularly refer to cases like China and Southeast Asia, but it is important that globalization brings benefits to not every section of the population. The reality of macroeconomic development seems to unfold that only a small portion of the population of the developing countries have benefited as a result of the impact of globalization. Aziz draws attention to the fact that the macroeconomic trends of development of some developing countries indicate that while output has registered moderate to fair increases, employment generation in all sections has lagged behind, and the benefits of growth have accrued only to a very small percentage of the population. The majority of the urban and the rural poor have become economically disenfranchised because of the failure of the system to generate sufficient means of productive livelihood. One definitely sees in the case of globalization the dominance of liberal capitalism on a global scale. Babu comments that it is well recognized that globalization, the dominant liberal capitalist international integration, and the new world order have been good only for some people and for some countries. Many people, particularly the poor in developing countries and in other countries as well, have not benefited materially from the post-Cold War globalization. The rich nations and the elite, the upper classes, the educated and the skilled individuals have been able to garner the fruits of growth and development disproportionately. And that is because we have to remain mindful of the fundamental truth that globalization does not operate over a level playing field. So because every person does not have the same opportunity to utilize the opportunities ushered in by globalization, obviously the outcome becomes very, very different. Naturally, who are the anti-globalizers, those who have not been able to set sail on the high tide of globalization. The poor, the marginalized, the unskilled, the minorities, and the working classes are the new anti-globalizers, and they can be divided into several categories. The first, we see the poor and the developing nations, and the poor and the marginalized people living in them. Second is civil society groups, the NGOs, and various other advocacy networks. They are often seen working in partnership with the UN and other international agencies seeking to address the problems of hunger, poverty, misery, deprivation, destitution, discrimination, squalor, torture, gender discrimination all over the world. The third category relates to the marginalized, the unemployed and the unemployable youth, working poor, victims of racial discrimination and social class privilege in the affluent countries of the West. So it's not that the West is all rosy. To these must also be added the passionate dissenters, empowerment groups, and above all, a number of perceptive thinkers and public figures who are deeply concerned about the excesses of global capitalism that goes on in the name of liberalization. It seems clear that globalization has thrown up a web of opportunities across the world, but not all are in a position to utilize them. It will be the responsibility of the state to a large extent to ensure that the opportunities do not become challenges, and the insurmountable ones at that, for all those lagging behind in the third world in particular. I have already drawn your attention to the fact that globalization operates in a playing field that is far from level. In India and as well as in other developing countries, there are various categories in all professions almost where everyone can't utilize the opportunities offered by globalization. The case of the Phulia weavers in West Bengal, for instance, reveal that although in the post-liberalization age, India has withdrawn, the government seems to have withdrawn from various fields, leaving more and more space to private producers to get into contracts with markets across the world and make it better for them. Not everybody can participate in global trade because they are constrained by various factors like depressing living conditions, unavailability of safety nets, inability to secure financial support. So all these problems ensure that these people often sink under the heavy hand of liberalization, although that may well be a boon for several sections. Elsenhans argues the so-called process of globalization does not introduce a worldwide equalization of living conditions, and it does not abolish the capacity of national determination of social structures and working conditions. Because of this limit to the thrust of globalization, the maintenance of a liberal world economy depends on the local solution of the problem of underdevelopment, as underdevelopment will not be abolished through the globalization process. And this is what tells us that these local strategies will have to be brought into place by particular governments. So while the state has withdrawn from very many areas, and that is what leads us to believe that the state has shrunk in an age of globalization, but this shrinkage is not in any way equivalent to any kind of eclipse of the state. The state has found itself saddled with new responsibilities, particularly with regard to those sections of the populations which are handicapped and challenged and who need to be given supportive measures so that they can be on their feet to take advantage of the opportunities ushered in by globalization, as is the case with the Phulia weavers, who need those support systems from the government so that they can carry on with their production and compete globally for global markets. Globalization requires appropriate localized strategies, which it allows. The limits to the generalization of capitalist structures at the level of the world system due to the continued existence of substantial pockets of marginality in the underdeveloped countries lend support to the conclusion that the realization of the dream of an open world economy requires regionally and locally implemented policies of structural transformation which complement the operation of the market mechanism by state intervention or other economic interventions on the basis of the non-market economy. So clearly the role of the state is highlighted. They imply a restriction of the liberal process in favor of developmental policy whether conceived by a state structure or other institutions of non-market economy. Clearly, therefore, the state has to act as a manager of globalization. I have already suggested that in his book, Jagdish Bhagwati comments that the state has to emerge as a manager of globalization. Scholars like him draw attention to the imperative need of a state for neutralizing the potentially negative effects of foreign investment and Western aid on the overall growth prospects of the developing countries. The state has therefore been saddled with a nuanced role where the state looks upon itself as some kind of a manager of globalization. Besides, enhanced responsibility in the social sector and popular mobilization against unpopular economic policies afforded by the democratization process, the state in the contemporary age also has to grapple with the challenges posed by the volatility of the international market and by terrorism. Globalization therefore impels social change that will result in greater moves to democracy, economic redistribution and the rule of law, and the promotion of civil and political rights. It is important to consider that as the new middle classes become more aware of its interests, it will become less willing to live under the rule of traditional elders, communist bureaucracies, or personal dictatorships. It will establish the rudiments of a civil society and organize itself to protect its interests. An emergent civil society will also begin to demand a more liberalized political sphere. Citizens will start to make their own interests known and will expect their governments to take their interests into consideration. After all, they cannot be wished away by any government as casualties of civilization. Citizens will want the rule of law to cover the areas of life beyond property and contract. They will demand regularity, they will demand fairness, they will demand predictability in other spheres of life, and they will raise their voice of protest in trying to make the government recognize the need to offer them rights and conditions which they have been denied. Kothari therefore posits the growing evidence of the rise of mass consciousness in India among the hitherto marginalized sections of society who have also begun to assert themselves in elections, in legislative bodies and the forums of political parties. In an age of globalization, this is contributing towards disempowerment and increasing marginalization of the state as a result of both the discontent and the alienation of the mass of people who had so long relied on the state for their own empowerment. These people have been of the view that the state is no longer available to them for the empowerment that they have been desiring, and they will need to devise their own independent strategies, and institutions increasingly rely on civil society and their own community resources to deal with problems they face in the contemporary age and in the days to come. So therefore, the poor and the marginalized cannot really give up on their state. The poor cannot afford to give up on the state as an institution or on the democratic political process, including the traditional avenues like elections and political parties. And in this context, definitely I would like to mention the case of the Forest Rights Act, which was enacted by Indian Parliament in 2006. And this is an apt illustration of the increasing role of the civil society vis-a-vis the state in India. The Forest Rights Act, in fact, did not emerge from unproblematic and consensual deliberations. Rather, the struggle to pass the act and to keep the key elements intact was fought with intense contestation. Central to the process of policy development in this case was the tremendous role that was seen through collective pressure and an unusual coalition of interests that spread across the states of India to make the Forest Rights Act a reality. Therefore, the case of the Forest Rights Act throws light on the importance of protests and campaign politics in India and the simultaneous importance of activists to form active coalitions involving individuals and groups in order to influence the course of legislation, thus confirming in no uncertain terms the increasing engagement on part of civil society in India in the process of legislation and policy formulation.